We've just really executed on what we wanted to do, but there's a lot more to do.
We continue to pour money into an outdated system.
The future of our public schools is at stake as Washington State School Superintendent Chris Reykdal faces challenger Maia Espinoza this fall. From how to deal with the COVID crisis to whether schools should teach sex ed, these candidates have much different lesson plans.
58% of respondents did not support a statewide mandate of sex ed curriculum.
I support the bill because it does put age-appropriate frameworks in place.
Everything good? Yep.
And how is the school year going at a local district that's one of the first to offer hybrid learning?
For the most part, we've handled all the issues that have come up.
It's time to hit the books before you vote on the state school chief. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. The race for state school superintendent pits incumbent Chris Reykdal up against political newcomer Maia Espinoza. Espinoza says she joined the race in opposition to Reykdal's support for a sex ed bill that you'll see represented on your ballot this fall with Referendum 90. But there are even more differences between the two candidates on how best to deal with the COVID pandemic, school choice, education vouchers, and more. While this is not a partisan position, Reykdal's clear support from Democrats and Espinoza's from Republicans has made this a very political battle for the future of our schools. Conway School District in Skagit County has only 300 students, but Conway took a big step this fall.
Squirt the sanitizer, stand behind your desk.
Opening school in the midst of the COVID pandemic to 85 kindergarten, first grade, English language learners, and special ed students, with 2 days a week in person and 3 online.
Get rid of the parentheses and combine like terms.
There's decisions every day that are coming up that we're trying to make.
Superintendent Jeff Cravy made the call to reopen, guided by the state superintendent's template for school districts and Skagit County health officials. But he's well aware that if cases rise again, this could all change.
That's the most difficult part, is that you start down a path of making a plan and you think you're ready, and then something happens and then we basically have to start over.
Often in fiction stories,
in-person classes are not happening for the majority of schools in our state this fall. Like most districts, Seattle went with an all-online model after COVID cases, especially for kids, spiked nationwide this summer.
I know this is going to be hard. I also know that we can work together to make the best of these circumstances and to help all students succeed.
It's a challenge in more ways than one for State School Superintendent Chris Reykdal as he gears up for a re-election bid.
We've just really executed on what we wanted to do, but there's a lot more to do.
Reykdal, wrapping up his first term, has raised more than $156,000 for his campaign as of mid-September and is endorsed by the Seattle Times, the Washington Education Association, and several former state school superintendents, including Randy Dorn.
Let's begin.
As head of our K-12 school system, Reykdal cannot force districts to open or close.
So yeah, I want our kids back in school in person, but now it really is a function of whether you're in high, medium, or low risk as a county, and that's been established by the governor. And so now our job is to help districts do a better job in remote learning.
Reykdal says this fall, 300,000 more K-12 students now have devices, and 60,000 more have an internet connection.
So we see a significant improvement, but nothing beats a face-to-face experience.
Reykdal also points to his work in closing graduation gaps for students of color and the overall school population, boosting pre-K classes, and helping dual language schools and kids with disabilities. But his challenger says it's not good enough.
We continue to pour money into an outdated system.
Maia Espinoza has never held public office, but this nonprofit leader has served on the OSPI's Opportunity Gap Oversight Committee and the Governor's Commission on Hispanic Affairs. She's raised about $130,000 for her campaign and is endorsed by State Treasurer Dwayne Davidson, several Republican state senators, including Phil Fortunato, and the Washington Farm Bureau. But what prompted her to enter this race was a concern over sex education.
My opponent is the one that ignored parents and educators and championed this policy.
State lawmakers passed Bill 5395 last session to provide health instruction that is medically accurate and age-appropriate. A lawsuit was filed to stop it, and it's now on your ballot as Referendum 90 this fall.
Oh boy.
Espinoza claims the bill teaches sex positions to kids and says this, along with a too slow rollout for school openings in the COVID crisis, illustrate a superintendent not listening to constituents. She's promising new ideas, like giving vouchers to families who'd rather spend their tax dollars on private or religious schools for their children.
I think my approach is very different. We want to make sure we're representing the customers of our public education system, which are the families and the students.
Reykdal responds that Espinoza's attack on the sex ed bill, including the claim it teaches sex positions, is full of untruths.
I understand politics. I don't respect dishonesty about a bill as important as this for safety.
And he warns against vouchers and privatized school choice systems that he says have hurt student achievement across the southern U.S.
So that's not choice. That's destroying public ed.
Espinoza is standing by her claims on Bill 5395.
It was a top-down mandate on something as sensitive as sex ed.
And she says parents should get choices and vouchers in a state where she says added McCleary money for public schools hasn't yielded results.
Our state recently more than doubled education funding, but we haven't seen student outcomes that match that investment.
Reykdal won the August primary in a 6-person field with over 40% of the vote to Espinoza's 25%. But this battle between progressive and conservative values has just begun. And we are joined by Chris Reykdal and Maia Espinoza. Thank you both very much for being here. We had a little bit of a coin flip before the show. Chris, you will be speaking first. Why are you running for re-election and what qualifies you for this job?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm Chris Reykdal, Superintendent of Public Schools for the state of Washington. My roots are really born and raised here in Washington. So the first thing I always communicate to folks was my experience in public ed. It was a real lifesaver for me. Youngest of 8 kids. Both parents had an 8th grade education, first in my family to go straight to college. That experience made me really want to give back to public ed. So I've been fortunate enough to be a Washington State Cougar and a certificated teacher in public schools, a school board member. I've worked in higher ed for 14 years, served in the legislature as a Democrat for 3 terms in the House and then this role. So I touched the system from just about every angle, and our focus obviously has been really trying to close opportunity gaps and get our graduation rates to record highs, which we have done. There's a lot of work ahead of us, but that background, that experience, and a graduate degree in public administration with a real focus on public finance, I think makes it a really powerful combination to have success in the role. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much for that. Maia, let's talk about why you're running and what your qualifications are, please.
Thanks, Brian. My name is Maia Espinoza. I'm running for the Superintendent of Public Administration position. I am a mom, first and foremost, of 2 kids in public school, both experiencing online learning right now, like so many other kids across this state. And I am a business owner. I'm a nonprofit director of an education-based civic engagement nonprofit for the Latino community of our state. And I was inspired to run for this office because I was sick of seeing, our public schools being used in a political and partisan way. This is a nonpartisan statewide office, and I thought that we needed to make sure that we're maintaining that integrity of this office. So I stepped up to run for this office, actually when that controversial sex ed bill was passed. Nothing against, providing sex ed in school, of course, but I definitely am opposed to making it a party issue or a partisan issue. So I jumped into this race. I have always had this platform, however, of reimagining an education system that truly works for all of the students in Washington. I'm a proponent of school choice, and I think that when we provide options in schools, we promote equity. So I've been a teacher, taught kindergarten through 8th grade music at a small Catholic school, and I certainly have an appreciation for what teachers do. I'm in the middle of pursuing my master's degree in curriculum and instruction. I should have that degree before the time I take office if elected. And I look forward to really taking advantage of this COVID situation to be able to create something new. So I'm inviting anyone and everyone to join our grassroots movement of reimagining education and making sure that the needs of parents and students are better reflected in our schools.
Thank you very much for that. And I want to talk about the COVID crisis to begin with here. Maia, the superintendent put out a template this summer for schools to use, a how-to basically for phasing into in-person classes. You told me when we met last week you didn't think a template was really enough. I want to tell everybody, if you can here, how your response to COVID in our schools would be different, especially at a time when nationwide we are seeing cases rise again as students head back to school.
Yeah, definitely. I think we need a measured approach for getting kids back to school, but I absolutely think it needs to be the priority. My opponent did put out this 52-page document of reopening schools, and I, feel that not only was it more of a restrictive document, but I think the evidence is there when a majority of districts opted to stay online. It shows that, as well-intentioned as this document was, it was not clear in a strategy of how to get kids back to school as quickly as possible. I'm very happy to see that schools are now starting to gradually send kids back to school. Certainly we need to prioritize kids of special needs and the younger ages. And so I think our approach would be more of a model of how to, and an on-the-ground approach of making sure that school districts are supported in those decisions and that we're working with the teachers union to make sure that parents, again, are reflected in these decisions. We know that keeping schools closed is very negatively impacting working families, where oftentimes mom is the one having to quit and stay home. And we know that the result of all of this has set women's pay equity back 30 years. If we talk about single parents in this equation, it's far worse. So our approach is a little bit different in that we have a focus on getting kids back to school, not the time to say, well, this is up to local control and you're welcome to do so, without that real hand holding at the local level to make it happen.
Chris, I wanted to make sure that I got your input here in terms of the backup plan you've put together. Do you think it's been doing a good job so far serving the students of our state? I guess if you had to give the superintendent's office a grade on how the COVID crisis has been handled so far, what would you say?
Well, a B plus or an A minus, I guess, if I'm being point blank about that question. The guidance is really a derivative of public health. And as we know in this crisis across the country and across the United States and across the world, public health officials have effectively had to make the decisions on open close. That's in their legal authority. In our state, it's the State Department of Health that helped us write that guidance. Very clear guidance on how to keep kids and staff healthy and safe when we return. Governor Inslee ultimately issued another order to make it clear when it's appropriate to bring students back. Are you a high risk, medium, or low risk county? And again, ultimately by law, that decision is a local school district's. The state superintendent can't force an open nor force a closure the way the governor can. And so what we've done is really walk alongside districts with this guidance document that shows them how to do it safely when it is safe. In many communities, it still is not. We see Georgia tried to open up quickly and it had to shut down many districts. The entire country of Israel looks like it's going to shut down again. The United Kingdom is on the verge of shutting down again. All of them had something in common. They wanted a race to get schools open really fast, and they didn't put the health framework in place that we have. We've also obviously supported the districts a ton with how to finance that effectively, how to deploy 300,000 devices statewide, 60,000 Wi-Fi connections and broadband connections. This is a really tough moment. And I have 2 kids in public school right now. They are also struggling with online learning. It's getting a little bit better all the time. But like them, I want them back in school. And that is what we are trying to do. But local communities have to take that walk with their local health officials and do it in a way that's safe and sustainable. Otherwise, we shut down, open, shut down, and that's incredibly disruptive for parents and families and obviously the overall economy.
Got it. Maia, I thought I'd bring this in. You have a couple of kids in the school system too. What has remote learning been like for them and your family?
Oh my gosh. I think, like so many other parents, it's been very stressful. I've got a grade schooler in fourth grade and I've got a middle schooler, very different experiences between the two. Both are complaining. And, these kids are lucky enough to have both of us as parents to help them through these challenges. But it's a real nightmare. I'm seeing an underutilization of certain technological abilities for the students, but also just the fatigue of kids being behind cameras. And once they're done being on cameras, they want to, jump to their video games. And so as a parent, I'm very concerned about their human development. And I certainly, I think all of us as parents understand the risks of getting our kids back in school, but we've got to find a way to make it happen. I don't think it's opening the floodgates, but online learning is really not the end all be all right now.
Chris, I thought I'd bring you in too. You touched on this briefly, but how has it been for your kids and your family with online learning? You have a couple kids in the system too.
I do, and I I think they both experienced it in some ways very similarly. More efficient than last spring for sure. Better learning management systems. We've trained thousands of teachers statewide to be better at this, but they're two different kids, and one is kind of thriving and okay with it, and one would really prefer the pure relationship work of being in school and what that means, the camaraderie of school and the relationship building. So two kids with really different experiences, and Kim and I are doing our very best to support them. Again, I want my kids in school, but I do trust my local school district to work with my local county health official to tell us when that's going to be safe and sustainable. That's the challenging part. And so one day at a time on that. Again, it's been great to at least build out the system. We're one of those states that's kind of ahead of the curve. And in fact, we just ranking recently about being #1 in the country for our educators, for our teachers. And part of that is whether or not we were effective in safely protecting them, returning to school with a plan. So yeah, this is a complicated time, and it takes real leadership right now to keep executing in partnership with the governor and health officials to do this in a way that's sustainable and healthy and safe.
All right, moving on here. Chris, I want you to have the first shot at a question about a sex education bill that has become a point of contention in this race. It's now on the fall ballot as Referendum 90. Your opponent has made claims about this bill that it teaches sex positions to fourth graders. She also says this bill was a top-down approach to a very sensitive issue for families. Bottom line it for us, why do you support this bill? How do you respond to your opponent's criticisms?
Yeah, we graduate about 1 in 6 boys and 1 in 3 girls from our system right now who have been victims of sexual abuse, sexual assault, or sexual intimidation of some form. This is a national problem. We've got a lot of school districts that don't do anything in this space, and we know from research that if you have a scientific, medically accurate based approach with professionals, you can help kids, you can support them, you can make a safer, healthier community. And like other subjects, education evolves, and there comes a point where the public health crisis of sexually transmitted infections and assaults and abuse supersedes that, a historic sense that this isn't something schools should be doing. And so we're super careful about respecting families and parents in this. I support the bill because it does put age-appropriate frameworks in place. It is really empowering parents because they have to be a part of the process of adopting it locally. Local districts adopt the curriculum. Parents can opt out of any or all of it, so they get total control around their family choices. But it's not okay anymore to have whole districts say we're not going to do anything in the face of a sexual assault crisis that we have. And so that's the whole idea here. I will remind everybody there are no sexual positions taught in any sex ed curriculum anywhere in the country, let alone our state. This was a clever political ploy to grab a third-party book and images from a third-party book. That's a parent reference. If parents want to work with their children, there's a book written by an individual who has cartoon sketches of that. It's referenced. In other words, it's parents say, hey, I want to work with my children more. There are other references. It's a reference material, but the proponents or the opponents of this grab those images, copy and pasted them digitally as if it's curriculum and images given to children. It's simply an awful, disgusting ploy. It is not true. It's been considerably debunked by the stranger and others. And so I don't appreciate the political tactics. I do respect that folks are sensitive about this and they want that choice. They get that for their families. Ultimately, the voters decide, but this is about the health and safety of kids.
Got it. Maia, back to you. I want you to respond to Chris's stance on this and also tell us why you oppose this measure, please.
Yeah, I don't think Chris does respect parental opinion on this, or he wouldn't have passed this bill through after taking a survey that showed that 58% of respondents did not support a statewide mandate of sex ed curriculum. It's also inaccurate to state that certain school districts weren't doing any type of sex ed. They were, and in fact continue to be required by state law to provide information on STD prevention, as well as Aaron's Law, which is essentially the good touch, bad touch. So what this bill really did was mandate a specific type of sex ed curriculum, again, against the wish of a majority of respondents. I happen to be one of those parents in Olympia, that showed up by the thousands. And, Chris ignored us. And I think he is suffering the consequences because of it. This bill, this bill will have a referendum on the ballot, which I'm told is the first time in nationwide history that a state will actually weigh in on whether or not to support sex ed. Again, the bill itself is not the problem here. The mandate certainly has issues to it, but it is these specific components in the curriculum that are approved and comply with the state law that are exactly the problem. You heard my opponent state, this claim that we made that this curriculum teaches sexual positions to fourth graders is not out of truth. It is a third-party handout, or I should say the handout is from one of those curriculum, and in the handout references this not age-appropriate book. So just because the law states that it's got to be medically accurate and age-appropriate does not mean that the actual curriculum that is sometimes being placed in the children's hand is age-appropriate. And that's exactly what parents are concerned about. This should not have been a partisan issue. This should have been kept to local control. And I think this was a top-down mandate that was uncalled for.
A few issues there. It is an issue of local control. The districts are able to work on this curriculum here, and also parents are able to weigh in too. I mean, they're able to opt out here. And I think that's one of the big issues that I've heard from some of the people who support this referendum here. This is something that allows for that freedom for different people to make those choices, but you don't see it that way?
No, certainly not as a parent, with kids in these grade schools. Just because your child is opted out or a few students are opted out, one, that relies on the teacher to make sure that they're completely opted out of any and all material. And two, that requires, a change in culture that happens in the classroom. When we are teaching these, advanced subjects to the entire class comprehensively from kindergarten through 12th grade, that's a culture shift that a lot of parents are uncomfortable with. And we're seeing record numbers of parents pulling out their students. This is not a simple opt-out. And to your point about the local control piece, if districts do want to create their own curriculum, that comes at an expense to the district. So essentially, this is another unfunded mandate.
Let me make sure, Chris, I want to make sure I give you another word on this before we move on to our next topic, please.
Yeah, there's a consistent inaccuracy about the description of this. The state, in my role as superintendent of schools, we don't pick curriculum for anybody, and we don't mandate curriculum, not in math, not in science, not in sexual health education, not in social studies. We review it for age-appropriate learning standards, and we bring experts in. We review curriculum and say, here's how it meets grade level standards. And then that group essentially says it may be chosen, and the law is very clear, it may be used if they want by school districts, or again, they can create their own. And these are pretty ubiquitous out there. Nothing is forced. And I want to just reiterate, the legislature asked us to talk to community. We did. They did not want the original form of the bill. They wanted more parent rights in this. The legislature responded with local adoption, local notification for parents in any grade where it's taught, and the opt-out strengthening. So the legislature listened to parents very specifically and then responded with a piece of legislation that I think balances parents' rights and this idea that we do need to do something. And we do survey school districts, and there were a dozen or maybe 2 dozen who did nothing despite the current mandates.
Got it. Thanks very much for that. I've got about a minute or so to talk about this, Maya. I wanted to talk about another big difference between your two campaigns here. This voucher program you've talked about. Families who get money from the state to pay for private schools, religious schools. It's a key difference here, and I know there's some back and forth. Supporters say this is about offering choices. Opponents say you're robbing from the public school system. Talk about this. What do you want to make work here?
Yeah, this is a classic argument that, we're robbing from local school districts to support other students, to support private school students. And that's simply not the case. We've seen this argument made in Washington, D.C., where we have the highest per pupil spending and the worst outcomes. School choice is important to me. I don't care if it's a voucher, a student stipend, or something to help promote equity in schools. But we cannot continue to allow poor communities, low-income communities, to have worse and suffering schools. We still are at a place where property-rich districts have an advantage, and I believe that the money in our educational system should follow the student. I've called for a $2,500 student stipend right now during COVID to assist parents having to make sure that their kids are educated, whether that's childcare, internet access, curriculum materials. This money belongs to the students, not the system.
Got it. Chris, I know you've heard this critique here and this idea about school choice. I know you have some different thoughts about that. Would you share those, please?
Yeah, the word school choice is really insincere because it really is a plan for many folks to privatize the system. There is a organized movement around the country. This has started in many states in the South. They have rapidly become the worst performing states in the country with these voucher systems. They are the most segregation-rich systems in the country, quite literally. You make this belief that everyone's entitled to the money, that there's not a common good about it, but a personal right to the money. And then, of course, families make different choices. And what happens is you completely segregate communities and schools again. And the performance of those students who can only take their basic ed voucher, but can't afford the premium tuition that often goes along with these religious schools and privately run schools, means that wealthy families get access to the best schools and low-income families get the worst. And so what has been more effective is whole investments in community. It's not just about schools. It's investing in community supports, whether it's housing, whether it's food, nutrition security, whether it's banking and access to lending. These kinds of larger approaches are far more sustainable and effective than a voucher. I would challenge anyone to not privatize our schools. After Hurricane Katrina, Louisiana went big on this. They are now the worst ranked education performance in the country. Vouchers are a segregation system we should avoid at all costs. And I would just ask you, imagine if every part of our vital public interest we said we're going to privatize. Hey, I don't use state parks. I want my money to go to Disneyland. I don't need national defense. I'll just arm myself and I'll bunker down by myself. Why should I have to pay into that? We create public systems for public good and individual benefit. And as soon as you start privatizing that, things go very badly and you continue to stretch the inequality that exists in the United States. Full community investment is the better solution.
Got it. Chris, I hear what you're saying, but I also hear the point that Maia is making here, and it has to do with money. Just following down this path here, state lawmakers put in $776 million into our school system in 2018, as you know, through the McCleary decision, but ended up lifting the levy lid for school districts, the local districts, the year afterwards. So these bigger local levies can create inequity in our state school system. That's the problem that McCleary was actually trying to fix here. I'm looking at that, and I'm also looking at a budget forecast for the state that is really bleak right now. I want to talk about the financial future for our schools and what you're going to do about it. Chris, let me start with you, please.
Yeah, we were more than 28% dependent on levies in the past. So more than 1 out of every $4 was coming from local levies pre-McCleary. The legislature cut that down to about 14%, got it down to just the enrichments. And all they did was bounce that back to 17 or 18%. So they made a little bit of an adjustment because they didn't think that in some of our urban areas, the cap that they had created was necessarily equitable. What they really did powerfully, though, is they added what's called levy equalization. Property poor communities get significant additional support. We've now closed that funding per student gap down to $1,000. There's still some work to do. I don't support depending on levies even further. I think they've had to make that little adjustment that they did 2 years ago. And now what we have to do is fight like heck to make sure that the legislature respects basic ed, that they continue these resources, and that they actually increase them over time. Now it's going to be a little tough, but the model did not fix mental health supports, nursing, social workers, school counseling. There's an entire support system that has to go around students that's more than just subject areas. That they came up short on. If you want Massachusetts results, the highest performing state in the country, then you need Massachusetts investments, and they're somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 more per child than we are. If you want Mississippi and Louisiana results, then call for voucher systems, debase the system, stretch the inequality even further. That's what I think the stark difference is here between my opponent and I.
Maia, your take on the financial future of our state school system. What ideas do you have to deal with those issues, please?
Yeah, well, there's certainly no correlation between funding and student outcomes. Where we do see outcomes is where we give parents choice. And I think this accusation that I'm trying to privatize our public school system is completely wrong. I attended school in the state of Mississippi, and I can tell you right here in Parkland and Spanaway, we've got worse schools. We have severe inequity in our state, and we squandered an opportunity. My opponent squandered this opportunity where we more than doubled state funding in education, and we've gotten very little for it. I don't think that our graduation rate of, or a dropout rate of nearly 20% is acceptable. And I don't think that our kids are leaving prepared for school, higher education, jobs, or the real world. So, I'm asking for a small portion of this funding to follow students, not the system. I certainly believe in our public education system, but I expect more, and I think we can do something different coming out of COVID.
Thank you very much for that, Maia. Before we get to a closing statement here, we have a few minutes left. I want to ask you, Maia, if there's an issue we haven't brought up yet about education, about your background here, that you want people to know about.
Well, I think we talk a lot about equity and making sure our most vulnerable are taken care of in our system. But unfortunately, under the current administration, we've allowed our most vulnerable to fall behind. I worked intently on a migrant education funding issue where my opponent is really all talk and no action. We presented options on how to resolve this issue. Our state receives the most federal funding support after California and Texas for migrant students. And yet migrant students across our state receive, at some cases, no funding at all. And that money gets recycled back into the general fund. These students need support, and it's not, a talking point. I'm actually here to fight this fight for our kids. I've lived in these communities. I represent these communities. And so this is very personal and important to me. It's not something you can put on paper, but it's something that we can do about it right now. Given the current situation, I want to do something different. And that does mean giving parents choice and opportunity and equity in our schools. So that's very, very important to me. Appreciate the chance to talk about it.
Yeah, and Chris, you can respond to that if you'd like, or maybe there's another issue you'd like to talk about that we haven't discussed yet.
Yeah, well, I'll add that this is a very complicated moment in our nation's history. We see now that we're 4% of the global population with 21% of all the COVID deaths. And sort of the catastrophic failure of the federal government, particularly this Republican administration, has left us all to bear, all to kind of do our own thing. So what I would really challenge listeners to this to think about is, how do we now move forward as a state, since we're clearly not going to get the help from the feds? How do we make sure we protect basic education dollars, that we continue to move those into the communities that need it the most? We do have record high graduation rates. Our students of color are now growing at a faster rate over the last 4 years than the overall average. We've brought bilingual education programs into 40 different school districts beginning in kindergarten. I want to be the first state in the country where every student graduates multilingual, to be the most competitive, the most successful, and the most globally competitive group of individuals that has ever been produced by a state. We've got work to do. It takes leadership. It takes relationships in the legislature. And obviously, that means really investing in our communities and our students and our schools, not using some market force that has been proven to segregate communities and schools and get worse results. We need to keep the progress that we're making, and to do that, we've got to come together right now.
Got it. I'm going to start wrapping up the show here. Chris, I can give you a minute for a closing statement here. Why should voters choose you for this position?
Well, experience. This is the superintendent of public instruction. 53% of the state budget comes through this organization to our school districts, where local boards make all of the really tough choices in their community to reflect their community. So it takes that balance. My background's actually in public education, not private ed. My background's as a school board member and as a public school teacher, higher education and K-12, the legislature and in the executive branch. And my graduate degrees in public administration with a specific emphasis on performance management and finance. So it's a combination of experience in the role, relationships that we've established, a background in finance and in education. This is not the time to experiment on voucher systems or a lack of experience. We're seeing that in other states, and the consequences are really dire. So really encourage folks to look into the race, research both of us, make sure you do your homework, and really appreciate the consideration of everyone watching.
Thank you very much. Maia, I'll give you the last word.
Sure. Well, I happen to disagree. I think this is a historic moment where we can try something different, and we ought to. What we have is not working, and it's not getting any better. And, I think we were caught with our pants down here during COVID to show that we were not prepared for a crisis, and we don't have a sustainable education model. We didn't even have technology integrated into our education system to allow for some kind of continued learning. This has been education in a free fall in our state. And I think it's absolutely time to do something different. I'm a big ideas kind of person, but I'm also a bridge builder. And I have experience in Olympia working with both sides of the aisle. I've been complimented on my work, been successful in passing bipartisan education legislation. And I look forward to continuing that credibility and bringing that to our students, making long-lasting and meaningful change in a system that's been so rigid that it doesn't allow for any new ideas. This is a factory model system that we've had for generations, and now is the time to finally update our system. I absolutely think that this is the moment in history to do that, and I hope to help lead this change. Again, reimagine education with me. Now's our chance to do it, and if you want to learn more about us, please visit our website, maiafrs.com.
Okay. Thank you both very much for your time, and we will be right back. What are people saying about online learning in our state? One person wrote this on Twitter: "Complete waste of money. Distance learning doesn't work, if you can even get the most vulnerable to log on." And here's another tweet: "Kids go back, virus breaks out in school. Teachers pass to each other, school shuts down. Start with a secure policy, then move forward safely." We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next week, the controversy over sex ed in public schools. On your ballot this fall is Referendum 90, a measure that would make sex ed mandatory in all the state's school districts for the first time. Supporters say the curriculum would be age-appropriate, plus parents can opt out. But opponents argue it's a misguided policy, and local districts should get to choose if they want to offer it or not. We hear from both sides, right here on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.